I was very proud of myself today because for the last week and a half, I haven't really worked on my work in progress. So then I was like, okay, I have a few extra hours today. So I will sit and I will do some writing. So the last time that I sat at my computer and I was writing this exact same scene, I was just writing some nonsense. I know where the scene is supposed to go, but I don't know how to get there. I'm just going to go to bed because clearly this is not going anywhere. And then today, when I sat down, all this typing happened and I was like, wow. Is that what happens with a good night's rest?
Yeah, that happens to me all the time. It's just go to sleep, let your brain clear out the cache, come back fresh in the morning.
It's so easy for people to tell you that, and you're just like, stop telling me that because it's not working. Until it actually happens to you, and you're like, interesting.
Sometimes I'll just leave a chapter like, I don't know how to end you. You're just going to be like this for a while. But you come back a month later, oh yeah, of course it's supposed to be this at the end. Of course that's how this works.
I'm a chronological writer, and so I can't just go to the next scene if this one isn't finished.
I'm so sorry. I won't go into it, but it's been a crazy, crazy day. I did not have water on at my house until about 5 minutes before I had to log in. So I'm doing bottled water today. That's what is happening.
Now I feel I have to double up on my drink just to make it for the two of us. I did have time to boil some water. I have a passion fruit and cherry tea. It smells so delish. Just want to eat it up. I know, right? Cheers.
Does it taste like passion fruits and cherries?
No, it just tastes like tea.
Oh, it just smells like
I'm always so disappointed. Maybe when I drink, I should sniff it, and maybe then it'll taste like it. I don't know how science works. Yeah. But you know what? Today we're going to be talking about psychology and about social science. So the word science is in there. So I'm very excited about that.
Yes. And with a special guest. So let's get going.
Hey ho, let's go. Hello everyone and welcome to Tea and Tales. I'm Marilu Hayes.
And I'm Sarah Sampson. Thank you to everybody for tuning in today and for tuning in on our social media and sharing our posts. We especially want to thank Shirley Phillips Cornby and Cindy Wallace. Today is a very special episode about psychology and social sciences in our writing.
I'm very excited about this special guest because she's my friend and I've known her since I was 6. We would love to welcome Marilu Hayes.
Welcome, Marilu, to Tea and Tales. We are so excited to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really honored.
Mel has told me so much about you. Tell me a little bit about your credentials and your background in the social sciences and psychology fields.
I did a master's in consumer psychology. I was always interested in human behavior. I actually came over to England to do that. That sparked the interest to kind of veer more into the clinical psychology field. I'm in the process of doing that. I am registered with the UK International Health Coaching Association, so I do practice as a health and wellbeing coach. I do specialize in things like trauma, ADHD, anxiety, depression, so some personality disorders, some mental illnesses and mental disorders. And then I do work on an individual basis mainly, but I do work with couples as well. I have a podcast that focuses on psychology and neuroscience, and I look at things from that perspective.
What's the name of your podcast for our listeners who want to dig more into that?
So it's called Facets with Marilu. I'm not as consistent as you guys. I can take a leaf from your book. When I get the chance, I do some shows, and I usually interview people as well.
In one of our previous episodes this season, we talked about networking specifically, and it entwines now with what we're doing today because I am networking with you to be on this podcast. We are very excited to have you on and to talk about characters and how you can make it the most awesomest character that you could possibly have so that 41 million years from now, people can still resonate with your character and not feel like they're from a monkey planet or something like that. I think one of the biggest things about psychology and characters and writing character traits is mental health. How would you say mental health differs from how people wrote it in novels years back versus how people look at mental health now and how they approach writing their characters in the present.
The most obvious thing to point out would be back then, everything was seen as like you're a crazy person if you had any type of mental illness, and you were immediately sectioned and put in an asylum, and that's the picture that was painted around a lot of mental illnesses. Whereas today, there's a bit better understanding of it. Thanks to the internet, a lot of people have a better access now to resources, so they can do their own research and get to the nitty-gritty stuff of what the traits are and how to put that into their writing. Whereas in the past, they had to rely on stories told by newspapers, like some person escaped from the asylum, and obviously they needed to kind of ham up these stories so that people would actually read the newspaper. And then stories would be told from person to person. Things would be added that was not necessarily true. Maybe he just had depression and he just didn't want to be locked up. For me, like, that would be the biggest difference from writing in the past as opposed to writing now. And also with the way science is changing and findings are changing with regards to psychology and the way language changes, I think that influences a lot as well.
If you're writing something that is historical, they may not have words for all the different things like we do. It's quite the balancing act, and I'm glad I don't write historical fiction for that very reason.
I definitely don't envy those people, because I think it is so hard to navigate political correctness these days. So to navigate that and be historically correct is so tricky. You have to be very careful how you word things and how you say things, and I think that's where the traits come in, playing on those things that people would like of the diagnoses necessarily.
A lot of agents want people who write from their own voices, because a lot of people write more neurodivergent characters. So I think there's also a fine line that people have to walk, because some people feel like it's their own voice and that nobody else can touch it because it's what they've experienced and that is their journey, and nobody else can tell it the way they do. Whereas sometimes you just write a character and that character might have ADHD, or that character might have OCD or depression or anything like that. You have to walk a fine line between deciding whether your character has a trait, or is it their whole being? Is it the whole topic of the story? Number one thing, research. You have to do your research so very well.
Not on TikTok.
You have to really vet your resources, especially with AI in the mix of it. You have to be so careful. And you also want to be respectful of the people who do have those issues and have to deal with it and live with them, which then again brings in sensitive readers.
If you know Avatar: The Last Airbender, they all have their little quirks, but Azula definitely has a strong arc of mental illness and mental health. So in your opinion, how would you like seeing the traumatic backgrounds and progression of these sorts of things handled in characters?
That's a very good question, because trauma is such an interesting thing. It's never linear. It's very up and down. Like, it's always a recovering process, and because there's always triggers. And even though you become more resilient to those triggers are still there. Wording is very important, because I know a lot of people have different triggers, and that's what also causes a problem, because unfortunately you can't account for everyone's triggers, because everyone's different and everyone's traumatic experiences are different. So writing about that person or that character's experience, focusing on things like physical sensations and things like that, could be very good way of saying that they're experiencing a trigger without exactly going into what the trigger is. Or they can actually go, towards the emotional side, like more play on like what emotions are the person feeling, or their actions towards other people. Those can be anything from freezing or fleeing, or it can be like robustness, like anger, agitation, things like that. So someone that's highly irritable for no reason constantly, that could be an indication of trauma. So there's subtle ways of showing trauma without necessarily going into the history of the trauma or triggers.
What I want to know now, though, is how would it differ if you're now dealing with somebody who has a trait like OCD or paranoia or narcissism? Do you approach it the same way, or is there a more interiority and thought processes of the characters?
I think with those thought processes are a very good way to go with. That thought process of how they're interpreting situations and experiences can be a very powerful way of kind of showcasing what that person is experiencing, and those traits will come out naturally, if that makes sense. So for example, someone with OCD will like have these intrusive thoughts, so they're compulsively cleaning or they're compulsively touching the door, but it still showcases that trait.
I love that you say that, because what I heard, what you said, is show. I think show versus tell is a writer's worst nightmare. It's even worse than having to edit your novel or write a blurb about your novel. When you tell me someone is a narcissist, I'm like, okay, cool, and I'm a unicorn. Thanks very much. When you show me someone is a narcissist, especially if you do it in such a way that in the beginning that person looks so super nice, and you're like, oh my gosh, I love this character.
They usually do.
Right. And then all of a sudden it's like, bam! Wait a minute, what are you doing now? My friend was reading this novel right now. It Ends With Us from Colleen Hoover. It's a woman and a man, and they're in a relationship, and so he all seems so nice and professional, and you know they're very great together, and then bam, he starts abusing her, and so you're just like, I don't like you now anymore. That is what gets the reader to empathize and to feel the character's trauma and the character's needs.
That's a very good example that you brought up. And people who have had traumatic experiences manage their triggers and stuff well, so they wouldn't put themselves in a situation necessarily where they could be triggered. So obviously they will read that this book has sensitive things in it. If that person is sensitive towards things like that, they wouldn't necessarily engage with that reading. It's important to understand, like, yes, you need to be sensitive, but also there's power in being raw as well and evoking those raw feelings, because that's what you want to do with these topics in some sense. And you want to kind of evoke that emotion and put that reader in that situation, obviously, you know, in a safe way. There's so much to unpack with kind of abusive relationships.
And I love that you talk about how that's how people manage what they read, which is why putting triggers on your book is so much important. But it also makes it harder to find those sensitivity readers, because you want people who can tell you, yes, you've portrayed it correctly, but if they don't want to read it because it's going to trigger them, they may not want to. And especially for memoir writers, this is something that I have seen. They want to write their memoir, get their story out there to help somebody else, but just in the writing of it can be really difficult for them to get those words out properly.
I think for them it's difficult from the perspective because that they have to relive that trauma essentially to bring forward those emotions. If they're not necessarily at a point where they are ready to do that, because a lot of people deflect from trauma healing because it's so difficult to go back to that point where they experienced the traumatic event. Usually in kind of therapy, you would take them back to a trigger response and kind of work your way back from there. But then with this, it's like you don't have that. You just have to go straight back to the source of the trauma, which can be very, very hard for a lot of people. And then to put that into words as well, I can just imagine like it must be so hard.
Yeah, I know. I honestly, kudos to people who write memoirs, because I don't even want to think about what happened in my life yesterday. Never mind my whole entire history of my life.
It makes movies like Inside Out, and Nell, you were talking about things like To Kill a Mockingbird and Encanto, things like that. When they're bringing forward these things in a kind of fun way that softens the blow but brings out so much truth. How do you feel about things like that help to represent mental states and represent disorders?
I think it's really good, because I think a lot of times people find it hard to put words to feelings and emotions. So most adults that I've worked with, if you ask them, how do you feel about this? They really get stuck. But it's not because they're uneducated or anything like that. It's purely because they're not in tune with the way that their body is experiencing things and the emotions. It's so difficult to kind of put words to emotions, especially with traumatic events, because your brain naturally just wants to shut down, and it just wants to push it aside. So to kind of ask someone, what were you feeling in that moment, is really very difficult. So we tend to focus on like somatic sensations, what people are physically feeling in their bodies, and then going from there. I think that's a good spin on it because it puts it in a fun and kind of like funny way. I think most people can relate to that. And the humor side of it as well. And it's easier to pinpoint because the characters are separate. Whereas when you're feeling something, a lot of the times feelings are muddled. So I think it's a good way of separating those emotions and like identifying specific characteristics of every emotion. People can relate to that better and be able to identify their own emotions.
Yeah, I don't know how the two of you watch movies because in all of the Inside Out movies and the Encanto movies, I just bawled out my eyes. I think I cry more in animated movies than I cry in real life.
I want to ask you this question. I'd put the main character through a lot of trauma, war trauma, torture trauma, things like that. She comes back home and everything's happy and nice around her, but she's struggling inside. The readers that I had who dealt with those things were like, yeah, that's so well done. I had a person who's never experienced that sort of stuff read it, and she goes, she just hangs on to it too long. She just stays grumpy for far too long. So maybe, is there anything that you can say that might help us to show them that process of coming back out, but in a way that's understandable for people who've never experienced that sort of thing?
I think what could be powerful is writing it from both perspectives, right? So writing it from the thoughts and experiences that the character's experiencing, but also the people around them. So kind of playing in between the internal and kind of external thoughts and behaviors. Your description was very accurate, so I would not veer from that. Maybe that could, I don't know, that, like I'm not a top writer for people who doesn't understand that that's how trauma works, and it's kind of like a spider's web. So that could be a way of kind of like bringing them out a little bit and just breaking it up so that they don't feel like it's constant in this mood.
I really like that. It also allows to show that reader perspective. Like maybe somebody around her is frustrated that she's still being so glummy, and you can validate your reader that way.
I also think it really depends on what genre you write. Because for romance, says the romance writer, the main thing about romance is two people falling in love and their love story and how they connect and meet and all that stuff. But in today's contemporary romance, we have individuals who do have mental illnesses, who do struggle with trauma, which is a beautiful way to show these elements in each character and their traits. But for specifically romance, that shouldn't be your dominating factor in the novel. Otherwise, romance readers are going to be like, oh my gosh, I could have picked up a women's fiction novel. So I think it kind of depends on what genre you write and how much of each of these mental health moments you want to insert in these situations. One of my friends was reading Redeeming Love from Francine Rivers, and she was like, oh my gosh, like this woman just drags on about like not getting over it and not getting over it. I'm like, okay, I understand you are getting frustrated because the same thing is happening over and over again. But if you look at it from the character's point of view, like if this happened to you, you would not just be getting over it in like 5 days. So you also get different types of readers, as Sarah said. And so some people will want to, go on that whole journey with a character. And then some readers just don't.
Yeah, you can't win them all. You can't please everyone, unfortunately. I would say like it's predominantly people you write to are people who enjoy that journey. Stick with it.
It's important to have in your mind whether the thing that you're writing into the story is just one piece of your character's personality, or if it's the center of the book. Like if you're John Green writing Fault in Your Stars, you're going to have some pretty central traumas that have to come out strong, versus a background character who happens to be OCD. It's going to come out in things that he says and stuff, but is every reader going to recognize that's what I did there? They're not. Probably wouldn't know if I didn't say it, but people who are familiar with it, I want them to see themselves in it as they're reading it. What should I avoid doing in my character to keep it from becoming intrusive?
I would say avoid taking your information off TikTok. So all seriousness, though, when we start adding too many traits and we're doing textbook traits, that could kind of come across as disingenuous. For example, if someone has ADHD and you're like constantly going on about things that they're hyperactive about, if you're constantly just like writing the characters if he's bouncing off the walls all the time, like, I think that can feel disingenuous. I think it depends very much on the situation as well and the character. So it's going to very much depend on what your character does and the storyline.
There's also character arc and character growth that we have to worry about. So especially when you have people like the pillars of community who grow in their status, or people who, maybe aren't so bad, but then their psyche gets worse over time. How do you work with those things and show that through their character arcs?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question. I think with that, you would go more like a little bit more excessive than you would just showcasing that there is something, because obviously you want to show that progress of, like, say for instance someone has schizophrenia. In the beginning there's subtle hints, and then it becomes more intrusive and prominent to the point where they really struggle and it completely disrupts their daily life. Usually we work on a scale of how disruptive is this of your daily life, and that's how we usually look at things. So that's a good kind of gauge to use with regards to things like this. So it can be like very little disruptive, can keep a job, can function properly, does everything that is required, to a point where it's like struggling a bit, missing appointments here and there, having twitches or whatever their traits are, and then to the point where it's completely disrupting their daily life and they can't hold down a job, they can't hold down relationships. So that would be a good way, I would say, of showing that progress.
That's very well said. And now I feel I have to go back to all of my normals and rewrite them. Thank you very much, Marilu.
And a lot of these people, like in the real life, kind of end up with addictions because it's an attempt to kind of self-medicate. So there's a good arc for anyone who wants it. It's completely an attempt to kind of self-medicate and to silence whatever they're dealing with internally. The people with mental disorders, mental illnesses are more prone to become addicts. Like, the research shows it. There's different bits that play on each other. Some people can get to a point where they can manage it and others can't. Also a good one is, like, it very dependent on people around them as well, because, like, maybe they have that support, maybe they don't.
You have to remember, and especially as a writer, that depending on what genre you write, you have 90,000 words to literally show a person's whole life. A person's whole life doesn't have 90,000 words in it. And it's very hard to compress a character's whole life into an 8-hour read. That's why it is so important to know your character and know which parts of their struggles and of their trauma and of their psyche you need to showcase and which ones need to stand back and take a back seat. And it's very hard to kind of distinguish that. And I think that is why it's so important to have beta readers, why it's so important to have sensitive readers, especially when you talk about mental health. And so it is all connected in such a beautiful, beautiful disaster. As a writer, you have a beautifully disastrous mind to be able to connect all those little dots and put it in one novel.
Spoken to people, their experiences are very unique. So to take that and put it into a book, it's going to be difficult for people to resonate with. You have to guide your reader through that journey, because otherwise they're just not going to get it.
That's beautifully said. I love that.
Absolutely beautifully said. We're so glad, Marilu, that you're able to come on today.
I want to say thank you so much for having me, and I really hope that you guys got something from it.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today. We like to keep things short and simple here on Tea and Tales. We'll get your fingers back on the keyboard and pens back on the paper.
And if you love what we are doing here, if you love the guests that we have on, go and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Tea and Tales Podcast, and on Twitter/X and TikTok at Podcast Tea Tales. And go to that purple little icon on your device and go give us 5 stars so that we can go up, 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 up to the top and keep you entertained.
And if you want to hear more from Marilu, we will have the links to her podcast in the comments. Happy writing!
Bye!